Chapter 27, Section 1 is called Postwar America. We'll be talking about the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, Truman being a Democrat and Eisenhower being a Republican, and we'll get to some of the differences and what that meant in the 1950s. But we'll also talk about how both leaders worked to make nation in terms of social, economical, and political adjustments to the country following the Second World War. The GI Bill passed in 1944, and the purpose of this was to ease veterans' return to civil life, which was huge. It paid, in many cases, full or partial tuition for university, public employee, or excuse me. It also had unemployment benefits that helped veterans transition from the military to civilian life, and it also had home loans and business loans to help people get on their feet. Think about it. 15 million men were mobilized to go into this war, and millions are returning home. What are they going to do? One of these problems of the First World War was that millions of people returned home and either put others out of work or found themselves unemployed, like the bonus army. And here we have the opposite problem in the Second World War. So many veterans are taking advantage of this bill and get guaranteed low-cost home loans and guaranteed low-cost business loans, and many are accessing college for the first time in their family. There's also a housing shortage. People cannot build houses fast enough to keep up with the demand, and as a result, you get new mass production methods, and many were developed during the war that were used to build homes quickly, and many people moved to suburbs, and suburbs are small residential communities surrounding cities. There also is obviously going to be some social adjustment. Many women went to the workforce more so than ever. We talked a lot about Rosie the Riveter, and in addition to the civil rights movement, there's going to be a lot of changes in gender roles after the war. For one, more women are emancipating themselves from broken marriages. They seek divorce, and obviously there's going to be a rise in divorce rate. Women did not want to give up this newfound independence that they had because of the war. Men would go overseas and they would have to make these difficult decisions for their families, and they became the breadwinners, and they just did not want to give that up. But in general, more people are getting out of bad marriages, and of course, this does lead to a rise in divorce rate. There's also some economic readjustment. The GI Bill was not a magic wand, and the post-war prosperity was not without its complications. Defense workers were laid off because we just don't need to build guns, tanks, and planes to the degree that we were doing during the war. And with that decrease in demand, defense industries had a decline in wages as well. Also, a lot of the controls that were being used to defeat the Nazis and fascists within the economy. I mean, think about the price controls that meant things had to be a certain price because the government mandated it. And these price controls ended because we went back to the normal laws of supply and demand. And so many scarce consumer goods went up in price, and it increased substantially, quickly. In fact, Congress wound up reestablishing some of these controls, but in the end of the Second World War, we saw a remarkable recovery from the Great Depression. People had money saved, and they were ready to spend it. And many veterans did start families at this time. Defense spending does stay high because of the Cold War and the concern about the Soviet Union. The first president to oversee this transition from war to peace was President Harry Truman. It was he who had to decide about the atomic bomb. It was he who had to make the decisions about the Korean War. And it's he who was going to assume responsibility of making many more difficult decisions. First off, the post-war inflation Remember, they had enterprise controls, but the lack of these means that the goods are going to go up in price, coupled with lower wages because we don't have the 15 million servicemen and 10 million defense workers anymore, and they got laid off. So obviously, there's economic readjustment that Truman has to deal with. For example, with mines and the production of minerals, the government takes over many of these mines. Coal mines, steel mines, plants, and the means of production, in many cases, did the government take over. In fact, when workers would go on strike, especially during the war, Truman resolved a lot of these issues in a very harsh way. He simply threatened to draft the workers and force them to do their jobs. Truman lost control of the Senate in his first term, so he found it difficult to even get anything done that he wanted to. In fact, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which turned over many of the rights that the union workers had won. Truman was very unique in a lot of ways. He was very progressive, and he wanted to do something about civil rights. And there was a lot of social pressure in relation to this movement. For example, there were 1 million African Americans who fought in the war, and when they returned, they demanded equal rights of citizens. But Congress was still very old-fashioned in the fact that they did not want to recognize the civil rights movement. But Truman was in a unique position as wartime presidents. These wartime presidents are extremely powerful, so he issued executive orders, one of them being integrating the armed forces by decreeing an end to discrimination and government hiring of war-related industries by executive order. These are two huge steps, and it's actually going to begin to identify the Democratic Party with the civil rights movement. The backlash of this in 1948 was that many Southern Democrats left the Democratic Party. Remember, that was the base of the Democrats. They were in the South. And dating back to the Civil War, the Republicans were a Northern party, but this began to change in 1948. It was a rather close election. Republican Thomas Dewey was slated to win this, and while it was a close political defeat, the Democrats were able to regain control of Congress, though they did lose many Southern states. Remember, Truman was FDR's vice president, and so he wanted to create a economic recovery plan that looked a lot like the New Deal. It was called the Fair Deal, and within it, he wanted to raise the minimum wage, create more infrastructure projects, and provide low-income housing. But then the Korean War happened, and then the Cold War happened, and then the growing threat of communism, and then McCarthyism. So Truman was often painted as being soft on communism, and his approval ratings began to drop over the Korean War, which was a difficult affair, difficult and tragic, and it went on for years, resulting in a stalemate and very tense feelings in northern and southern Korea. Every president since Truman has tried to fix this situation, but still, tensions are high. And Congress does pass parts of this fair deal, but many of the ideas that Truman had were just completely shot down. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a general during World War II, ran for president, and he received the Republican nomination. He won the role of the President of the United States after Truman decided not to run for re-election. The Republicans get a resurgence, but Dwight D. Eisenhower was what we would call a fiscally conservative and socially liberal president. And the Republicans really gained in this election from the southern states that left the Democratic Party. Eisenhower was not without his flaws. He tried to avoid the civil rights movement, but the real reality behind this is that it was a popular movement. It was a grassroots thing. It gained strength even throughout his presidency. And he had to walk carefully because many states were watching how he reacted to these social civil rights issues. Economically, he worked for a balanced budget, but he also pushed for a lot of social legislation like a federal Department of Health, a Department of Education, and a Department of Welfare. In closing, I want to give you a famous quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower. Remember, he was a famous general in the Second World War. He says, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed in this world. In arms is not spending money alone, it's spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hope of its children." Um, Eisenhower gains popularity massively and is reelected in 1956. Um, we'll talk more about Eisenhower in the next section, but this is the end of section 1, and the quiz is about to begin.